baking alternatives from an amateur chef. This episode, I'm really excited to share another allergen-friendly recipe with you guys. I'm making chocolate chip cookies, and this recipe is an absolute staple for my family. Let's get started. For these cookies, we're going to be substituting 2 cups of almond flour for regular white all-purpose flour and the coconut oil for the butter. Now, if you're trying to go vegan, I would really suggest using syrup instead of the honey, a vegan substitute for the egg, and obviously vegan chocolate chips. So, to get started, we're going to be mixing all of our dry ingredients in one bowl. So, start off with the almond flour. We're using the Bob's Red Mill brand. It can be a little expensive if you're trying to find a substitute, but we really like how it doesn't really change the texture of any of the desserts. Okay. 2 cups. And now we're going to be adding 1/4 teaspoon of salt, but since it's just 1/4 teaspoon, I kind of just eyeball it. If it wants to come out. I just kind of do a little sprinkle. And then a 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda. And because this recipe doesn't really call for sugar, I'm going to be adding a heaping half of a cup of brown sugar. Now, if you didn't add any sugar, the cookies would basically be a biscuit, and that's not really what we want. We're going for the cookie, right? This is the brown cup. That would have been a lot of sugar. And so I just like to add a 1/2 cup of brown sugar because it really adds flavor and obviously sweetness. You know, you're going for the cookies, not the biscuit. And I always add extra chocolate chips as well because the recipe doesn't call for that much. Okay. So I just add that sugar in with the dry ingredients. Okay, and now we're going to be mixing it all together. Just kind of try to make sure it's mixed really well and incorporate all of the ingredients together. We don't want clumps of brown sugar or almond flour, because that would be really nasty to bite into. You could sift it all if you wanted to, but I value my arm strength and my time, so I am not going to be sifting. Now for the wet ingredients. We're going to be adding 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. And then I'll be adding 3 tablespoons of honey. And I'm going to be spraying my tablespoon with pan cooking spray so the honey comes out easier. A little hack for you. So when you pour in the honey, it just glides on out. Ugh. Okay, so now that I have my 3 tablespoons of honey, and actually 3 tablespoons because I didn't have to scrape any out and none of the honey is actually stuck to the tablespoon, I'm going to just give it a little whisk to incorporate the coconut oil and the honey together. And remember, if you are trying to do a vegan recipe, a vegan version of this recipe, then substitute the 3 tablespoons of honey for 3 tablespoons of maple syrup. Now I'm going to be adding 1 egg. And again, if you're doing vegan, I would suggest using like a flax egg or another vegan substitute for the egg. I am not fancy and I cannot crack an egg with one hand. And if you don't already, please wash your hands after cracking an egg. We don't want no salmonella up in here. Fun fact, I cannot crack an egg with one hand. As hard as I try, it always ends up in an absolute mess. So I am lame and only crack an egg with two hands. Now that all of the wet ingredients are incorporated together, and I always add a splash of vanilla, even though the recipe doesn't call for it, because again, we don't want no biscuits, we want some chocolate chip cookies, and this just adds a little bit of flavor. I probably add like half a teaspoon, just a little splash to give it a little flavor. Okay, so now that both the dry and wet ingredients are mixed together, I'm going to be adding the dry to the wet. I'll only do a little bit at a time because, once again, I value my arms and would rather them not fall off from mixing. Okay, so I finished mixing the batter. I added about a third of the dry ingredients at a time so I wouldn't spill everywhere. After the second third of the dry ingredients, your batter should start getting really thick, and you almost kind of have to knead it with the spatula to get everything incorporated. The end result of the batter, it should be nice and thick and a little sticky. And now we're going to be adding the fun part, the chocolate. Now for the chocolate. As you can see, I cleaned up a little bit just to have some more room. To add a little twist, I'm doing some leftover Halloween candy, and I'm going to cut that up on my cutting board. If you're ever having trouble with your cutting board, I always put a wet paper towel underneath mine. That way it doesn't move around at all. I'm going to be cutting up some of this Halloween candy. Obviously, if you are trying to be allergen-friendly in this recipe, only use candy that is safe to eat for you. Or don't use candy at all. I don't know. I'm just trying to add more chocolate into my recipe. But I'm cutting up with this big scary knife some Snickers, a Tootsie Roll, some M&Ms, just to give my cookies kind of a fun little crunch, a little bite of some different flavors. And while I'm cutting, the oven is heating up to 375 degrees. And we're going to be baking the cookies for around 8 to 9 minutes. Now I'm going to be adding this into the batter. Make sure your chocolate is evenly spread out in your batter because no one likes to get a cookie with no chocolate in it, because then it's basically a really sad biscuit with a little sugar in it. Because the cookies don't rise much, I was able to fit 16 of the cookies on the tray. They're going in the oven now at 375 degrees for 8 to 9 minutes. Okay, so the cookies are done. And I know they look kind of right now, and they look like biscuits. But I promise they are delicious, and just because they look kind of strange does not mean that they won't taste great. Okay, so I got the cookies on this cute little platter. I did smush them down a little bit because if not, they'll like rise up and puff up like a biscuit again. I don't really know why these are so similar to biscuits. But anyway, and these are our chocolate chip cookies. I'm really excited with how they turned out. They're very consistent too. They will come out the same every single time you make them. They are so, so delicious. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this recipe, and you should really try it yourself. They are so good, I promise you. And I'll see you next time. Stay sweet.